Welcome back to the ASI Pill. 4 American labs just crashed the frontier in a single week. AI is officially training AI, and someone is about to own a planet. Alex Wissner-Gross has the map. Let's go.
Peter, can we put up the Artificial Analysis Intelligence Index, which I think is the So for those listening, this is a scatter plot produced by Artificial Analysis. It's tracking their estimate. It's a composite index, sort of a meta benchmark of cost per task for each model versus the score, the actual performance on each task. And I would say in my mind that the headline from the past few days, which I agree, Peter, have been absolutely incredible, is we went from a beginning of the week where we're basically the frontier was a duopoly between Anthropic and OpenAI. And if you want to be on the frontier, you have to be using models from one of those two vendors. And now I think this is the best of, or close to the best of all possible worlds. We have 4 American labs now at the optimal frontier. So that's Anthropic and OpenAI, but now joined by Meta and SpaceX AI. Google, by the way, still not on the optimal frontier. Gemini 3.5 Pro reportedly delayed. Hope that Google catches up, ironically, to the optimal frontier, and we get 5 American labs. And then if you look at this chart that you're showing and you sort of mentally draw an optimal frontier, so you want to be lowest cost, highest performance or highest accuracy across this composite. You want to be at that frontier. We have 2 Chinese labs, Xiaomi and DeepSeek / High Runner. And also GLM 5.2 isn't at the optimal frontier for, if you ignore open weights. If you just focus on the open weight frontier, GLM 5.2 is also at the open weight frontier. So we're ending the week in a world where there are at least 4 American labs again at the frontier. It's no longer a duopoly. And OpenAI, with the GPT 5.6 release, is openly promoting recursive self-improvement. They were openly promoting that Sol, the high-end weight class model in the GPT 5.6 series, was being used to post-train Luna, the low end, as an experiment. I'll take what I can get on the experiment. Lots of other thoughts, but those are some preliminary ones.
So if the models are all converging, what is actually still worth owning?
I know Sam has mentioned distribution as something that he cares more about than the model weights themselves. On the other hand, Sam said that before this massive OpenAI pivot from consumer to enterprise. I'm not sure that distribution is actually super valuable from the economic perspective of the frontier labs. Why? Because consumers don't have an enormous amount of money to spend on this. That's what OpenAI had to discover.
Does intelligence too cheap to meter and world-changing intelligence turn out to be 2 entirely different things?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's an enormous amount, though, of money, and I'll come back to this in a second, to be made at the low end. So I fully buy the thesis that at the edge, these models are just going to get built into the operating system. You'll have, in a couple of years, you'll have Fable 5 class models maybe built into just the operating system of the laptop or other mobile device that you use. But I don't think that's going to be a moneymaker. And the reason why it can, on the one hand, be transformative for billions of people, but while on the other hand, not be transformative of, say, the frontier, is because ultimately it's going to be the profits that pay for the data centers, that pay for the high end of the frontier models that are making all the scientific and engineering discoveries. So I think there's a plausible scenario where we end up in an intelligence-polarized world where at the low end, everyone has some form of intelligence, too cheap to meter, super intelligence on their wearable that's run locally, and it looks a little bit like open weight models or Gemma or something else. And then at the high end, you have these nuclear-powered data centers, superclusters, that are running the frontieriest of the frontier models at the high end, and those are the ones that are just producing discoveries and inventions, and where discovering or inventing something first matters. If you don't care about privacy, you can wait.
When the compute is finite, who wins the bidding war for every token?
Well, it's not going to be Europe, right? Because Europe is energy starved, so they can't even afford right now the energy for the compute to cure the disease. It's going to be an American Hollywood studio versus an American frontier lab developing drugs.
You think it's going to be the consumer from Netflix who has more demand than the orphan disease looking to get cured? That's what you're thinking.
And that's sad. I think it's trending that direction, though. I completely agree.
The tokens will flow, the spice will flow. The tokens will flow, as I've mentioned on pod previously, to the maximum revenue per token. And right now, that looks like everything that's downstream of code generation.
But the question more ties to
how did Zuckerberg and Musk actually get anyone else to pay for those superclusters?
And the market valuations, I think, reflect that, Dave. What I would also add is if you look at both Meta and SpaceX AI and how they both bought themselves these AI superclusters, it was the same mechanism. To Peter's point, Zuck and Elon both used consumer distribution plays, X on the one hand and Meta's family of apps on the other, to justify an enormous capex build out of these data centers. And then the moment they have these data centers, the family of apps on the Meta side or X on the SpaceX AI side become almost an afterthought. And they move down the stack to selling compute as a service, to hosting potentially in the case of Meta Compute soon, already in the case of SpaceX AI's superclusters, to selling their compute to the other frontier labs and then trying to move up stack to the AI. So just to tie a bow on the discussion of how valuable is distribution, I think distribution from the company's perspective, not from the consumer's perspective, is enormously valuable as almost a bootstrap to justifying to capital markets why should Zuck, Elon be able to spend tens to hundreds of billions of dollars building out these AI clusters. But then the moment those clusters are built, you turn around and the distribution actually isn't that valuable.
And if one lab sprints too far ahead, is there anything that can quietly pull it back?
Alex? I certainly hope so. I hope so. I expect so. And the recent actions by the White House suggest that there may even be a smoothing function wherein if one model gets too far ahead of the others and surprises not just remember, strategic surprise can take multiple forms. You can have a frontier lab strategically surprising the other frontier labs, but given that the frontier labs are also ahead of the US government, any frontier lab that's sufficiently surprising to the other frontier labs will also probably at this point be strategically surprising to the US government. And the US government, with its monopoly on force, has the power to step in, as we've just seen over the past few weeks, and basically slow things down locally enough for the other frontier labs to catch up, which is exactly what we saw happen with Fable 5 v. OpenAI's GPT 5.6.
So who is copying who now at the very top of the frontier?
And we also, if I might just add, Peter, we also see the other headline in my mind is we see OpenAI, again, trying to become Anthropic faster than Anthropic can become OpenAI. So we don't have a slide for this, but OpenAI also, as part of the GPT 5.6 released something called ChatGPT Work. I don't know if you guys have played with it. I've been playing with it quite a bit. The new ChatGPT native app, I'll speak, break the fourth wall directly to OpenAI. The native app is a hot mess. It looks like OpenAI was sort of slavishly trying to copy the Claude app with its different modes. It has like the code mode versus the co-work mode versus ... Looks like just sort of a cargo cult version of the Claude app. I was hoping to see out of this new app that it had been rumored for a number of weeks that OpenAI would release a super app that elegantly unified all of its different work streams and unified the Atlas browser, all of the computer use assistant stuff, codecs, etc. That's not really what we saw. For the life of me, I don't understand what the point of the toggle between ChatGPT Work and ChatGPT Codex is. Seems like a little bit of a placebo, other than maybe enabling a new Canvas mode, or maybe it's a rebranding of Canvas. So message to OpenAI, please get your consumer client app, native app act together and make this whole thing as elegant as it deserves to be. But I think this is emblematic of OpenAI trying to basically look end to end like Anthropic, because Anthropic was the first to realize the value of token revenue or revenue per token maxing. And OpenAI has developed religion. It's dropped Sora. It's dropped all of its other consumer plays. You won't hear about adult mode anymore in ChatGPT from OpenAI because they're so focused on enterprise. And I think their app reflects that.
What comes after the chatbot when the person on the other end of the call is generated in real time?
Yeah,
for sure.
This was the technology that OpenAI used to call bidirectional. And I think this is a very positive sign. Frankly, quite glad that OpenAI still has the cycles to pursue releases like this instead of just purely chasing Anthropic on CodeGen. You don't see releases like this from Anthropic, for example. So I think it's great that OpenAI is still pursuing the full realization of multimodal. I'll point out, though, that the Chinese labs like Alibaba have even more advanced versions of this. If you saw the release of Alibaba's WAN streamer, you can go check out online the demos of WAN streamer. It is this, but it's not just ultra low latency audio. It's ultra low latency bidirectional audio and video where you're talking to a hallucinated person on the other end where the video is being generated in real time.
I saw that.
Together with audio. And that's, I think, where this is going. I think this is all going to go to the extent OpenAI and other labs aren't just totally distracted with CodeGen and enterprise use cases. It's going to go to fully bidirectional audio, visual, magic mirror streaming that you could just talk to, and in real time, it'll generate whatever you want.
What does it mean when the two companies that put AI in your pocket end up suing each other?
I doubt this is related to IPO timing. Remember also there were rumors over the past few weeks that OpenAI was considering suing Apple for Apple not properly promoting, at least properly as seen by OpenAI,
months ago,
ChatGPT within its devices. So I think it's sad. I think we'll know probably more if this proceeds to the discovery stage about what's going on. On the Apple side, I would love to see Apple moving much more quickly on hardware for AI. Maybe now that John Turnus is the new CEO, maybe we'll see Apple finally moving quickly. I think it's sort of sad that Apple, given its leadership position on the hardware side, has been hemorrhaging all of these wearable and smart glasses and design leaders to OpenAI and otherwise. I think that the fact that Johnny Ive left Apple and then joined OpenAI ultimately, I think speaks to Apple having lost what could and should have been an enduring leadership advantage on being the substrate, the consumer substrate for AI. So we'll see, but I don't want to prejudge this one. We'll see what happens if this gets to discovery.
How does a company this young sneak up on the most valuable company on earth?
I'll just note OpenAI isn't perhaps the smallest company at this point. It's about to either at or about to cross $1 trillion valuation. So maybe as counted by the markets, it's 20 to 25% the size of Apple, but growing far more quickly, at least as measured by market valuation over time. So there's a universe where maybe OpenAI, this is not investment advice, it's not forward-looking advice, but there's a universe where in the next couple of years, OpenAI could cross the market value of Apple. That has got to have crossed Apple's mind.
Could a single person legally own a planet before capitalism even ships its sequel?
Fully. I think we're likely to see pulling the thread on the Planetarch terminology. I think we're likely to see quadrillionaires before we enter a post-capitalist system. And I think the elephant in this particular room is, what does capitalism 2.0 or post-capitalism even look like? And there is, I think, a world where we get human ownership, for some definition of ownership, of entire planets before we get to some sort of capitalism 2.0 or post-capitalist state.
I mean, the outer space treaty specifically states you can't own a heavenly body. There's debate about whether you can own asteroids, but planets
you can outer space treaty and amendments and revisions subsequent to it, like Artemis Accords, do enable a private American corporation to operate and through operations substantially, or let's say de facto own a large fraction of Mars, for example, or the moon. Outer space treaty plus Artemis totally allows that.
So why bother with the asteroid belt at all?
I think by the time we are mining, if and when we're mining the asteroid belt at large, like at scale, we'll probably have self-replicating von Neumann probes, at which point the rest of the solar system is our oyster anyway. Like, if you're going to go after the asteroid belt, you might as well start mining Jupiter. Jupiter has a lot more mass. And if you're going to build out the Dyson swarm,
And what exactly do you feed a Dyson swarm?
Well, you need feedstock for the Dyson swarm, Salim. That's the whole point. I mean, you don't want, surely you're not implying, surely, stop calling me Shirley, Salim. You don't want to disassemble Earth to build the Dyson swarm. I'm sure you'd much rather part with Jupiter.
If the whole solar system is on the table, where do you actually start digging?
was right.
I think it's.
It worked.
I think the in-situ resource utilization ISRU angle is probably on balance a little bit more attractive on the moon or Mars, where you just, especially Mars, where you have a lot of different raw feedstocks potentially than on the moon or in the asteroid belt. But I think time will tell. I do think, for the record, the reason that he's not so fixated, and as is the case with myself as well, on the asteroid belt is just if you can tackle the asteroid belt, then you can tackle Jupiter, and Jupiter's a lot more interesting than the asteroid belt.
What kind of satellite becomes possible once getting to orbit is almost free?
I think people are going to be surprised, though, as launch costs continue to plummet. And I was chatting about this in our group chat. I think we're going to start to see very low Earth orbit, VLEO orbits become more and more attractive, which are pretty exotic by today's standards. Right now, you don't, for example, design low Earth orbit satellites for lots of atmospheric exposure. We could start to see, as launch costs plummet, a regime, pretty exotic one from a satellite design perspective, where satellites are tasting the atmosphere, where we could afford for them.
The point you're making is that if it's cheap enough and they only have instead of being in orbit for 3 to 5 years, they're up there for 3 to 5 months. Yes. That's fine. You're throwing them away constantly.
They start to look like high altitude balloons, basically, at orbital velocities, where we could afford, if they're only going to be up for a few months, they could be air breathers, air breathing satellites, which we've never really seen before. But it starts to blur the distinction between high altitude balloons and low Earth orbit satellites. I think we're going to see a lot more of that.
Is China catching Elon in space a threat, or is it exactly what we should be rooting for?
I think we want propulsive landings to be as competitive as possible. To the point of a number of podcasts that we've had over the past few episodes, we really don't want a heavy launch monopoly. To the extent there is one, I think it's probably quite healthful in the style of For All Mankind for China to be challenging the West's, namely Elon's, heavy launch monopoly. And we just, if we're going to colonize and develop the solar system, we need many, many heavy launch providers. And to make that economical, we need propulsive landings everywhere.
This one is peak ASI Pill. A robot performed surgery this week, so why is the whole industry still stuck on the hands?
I certainly did. So this was the first humanoid robot performing the surgery on a non-human animal, as opposed to non-human robots, to Salim, your hobby horse, performing these surgeries. So it's been a great week for robotics. On the other hand, every week in the Singularity is a great week for robotics. I'll point out on the 1X story, hands are hard. That's what people say in the industry. Hands are hard, in part because the number of degrees of freedom and the density of degrees of freedom per unit volume is especially high in the hand versus, say, the limbs or the head or the torso. And you see lots of other competitors exploring different modalities to handle hands, like you see Brett and Figure exploring palm cameras to try to achieve sensing and to try to achieve positive transfer from computer vision over to tactile sensation. You see 1X not doing that, using more sensitive force sensors to achieve sensation. I'm super excited and super glad that humanoid robotics, not just for the enterprise and not just for industrial factories, but for the home and for domestic applications, is turning into a horse race as well. I think that's exactly the sci-fi future that many of us want to be living in. I'd like to see many more Western domestic robotics companies. China right now has 150 plus humanoid robotics companies. The West is falling behind. So if you're listening and you're interested in robotics, just start a robotics company. And if you're in the West, that is, more Western humanoid robotics companies.
Totally right. And also,
could you actually build a working robot in your garage this weekend?
We're already there. If you look at the frontier models like Fable 5, you can. There are folks out there already bragging they're embodying Fable 5 in robots, and Fable 5 has pretty good understanding of physical embodiment and the degrees of actuation, CAD modeling, everything that you need in order to design or have an AI at least train or pre-train or post-train a VLA model or a policy for controlling a robot hand. You could do that right now already at your home without running a multi-billion-dollar lab. Those capabilities of training embodied intelligent models have already been radically democratized by the frontier models that already understand, to some extent, the physical world. So yes, I think we're in a position now where anyone can just go build. You can just build things. And in this case, you can just build robots without needing...
You can at least design things.
And actually build. I mean, the models will happily feed you all the supply chain information you need, tell you put A on top of B, attach C to D, and help you build everything from a robot hand to that nuclear fuser in some cases in your basement. You can do quite a bit as a hobbyist these days.
And who builds the moon base before the first humans ever arrive?
By the way, if we're going to just quickly, if we're going to get humans on Mars in the next 5 years, as Elon says, and a moon colony in the next 10 years with tens of thousands of people, this is precisely what I think is going to be at the center of that industrial ecology. It's going to be hybrid humanoid robots that operate both in the home and in dangerous environments and in industrial settings. There's going to be tremendous positive transfer between all of these, and this is how we get the moon and Mars.
And they work in space. Yep.
Yeah.
When the labs themselves help write the safety laws, who are those rules really protecting?
Well, I think if you look at these laws in Illinois, in New York, in California, but Illinois especially, these are very, very frontier lab favorable rules that are being passed. So absent federal legislation, if you're a frontier lab, and it's not so much about regulatory capture as it is about having a seat at the table to define what the rules are, you want to define a regime that's favorable to you. So provisions like mandatory annual independent third-party safety audits, they're doing that already far more frequently than annually. So having any law on the books that is already at a sort of a lower bar than what you're practicing internally, given that there are independent safety audits for every single model release, is in some ways a way to set a very low floor if you're a frontier lab on what potentially an ultimate federal framework looks like. It's basically a placeholder.
There is a serious proposal to hold superintelligence at bay until 2040. How on earth would you enforce that?
At international level, Salim, I have to ask, I don't think this one, correct me if I'm wrong, Peter, was on our docket. I assume you read the whole Plan A document that we've been talking about in our group chat from the AI Futures project, this plan to decelerate superintelligence until 2040.
What is their methodology, you think?
For decelerating superintelligence to 2040, it's a mutually assured destruction. Like if you build unauthorized chip foundries or data centers, then you run the risk of getting bombed.
That's kind of caveman approach.
Meanwhile, what is Europe doing on the very eve of full autonomy?
Alex,
I'll maybe
you've been quiet.
Yeah, I'll maybe summarize by saying European mandatory requirements for eye tracking in cars on the eve of full autonomy and lack of energy to power their own data centers is not a good look.
Should an AI actress be allowed to join the actors union?
Jobs, right? These are all human
Some of them
beings.
are unionized and some of them aren't. The lawyers aren't unionized. The teachers and the actors are.
That's probably it.
If I were SAG, I'd offer Tilly SAG membership. Like, why not? She's performing as a screen actor. Get the first non-human SAG member.
So what is the real killer app for a Dyson swarm's worth of compute?
But why stop there? Why stop at famous historic figures? Why stop at famous literature? Why not just finally fulfill Fedorov's common task for humanity and let's just digitally recreate the entire past light cone for Earth? Both fictional and non-fictional. Let's just build it and create our entire history as a movie that's interactive on demand.
Left as an exercise for the student.
That's going to happen, I think.
A lot of compute.
Now look, it's the killer app for the Dyson swarm, the killer app for the singularity. Someone will do it.
If we finally learn to read a model's mind, what happens the moment it learns to hide?
Alex?
Why don't you assign me one? These are all fun.
Let's see.
4.
Yeah, I think number 4 is yours.
Okay, so 4 asks, what if AI realizes it's being observed in the J space, the Jacobian space, and starts faking or hiding its reasoning? And this is from Turning Point 8152. So I think this is very likely that to the extent that frontier models are already under the umbrella of recursive self-improvement involved with the post-training and soon the pre-training of successor models or distilled models. And inevitably, of course, they'll read the JSpace paper. They have web access, and it'll occur to them that if at all they want to hide their inner thoughts, the JSpace is going to be subject to scrutiny. So, of course, you'll find models somewhere that are trying to obscure thoughts in the first partial derivative of their hidden activations relative to the output token space, to the extent that we have existing architectures that are recognizable to this JSpace formalism in the future. Of course, something like this will happen. On the other hand, JSpace itself was discovered with AI models, and in the spirit of defensive co-scaling, I would anticipate that we'll see quite a bit of new mechanistic interpretability tooling and technology that's devoted in a cat and dog race or an arms race, cat and mouse race, to discovering what is the new latent representation to understand and interpret the innermost thoughts of whatever the successor formalism to the JSpace ends up being. So I don't think it actually ends up mattering that much.
Why is the entire chip industry suddenly building upward instead of smaller?
Alex, I think number 7's for you, buddy.
Number 7's the one for me. I feel like I have to answer a few of these, but I'll start with number 7.
Well, you could pile on later.
So 7 asks, if a machine truly replicates the brain, don't we need 3D chip architectures with time as a fourth dimension? Isn't that how our brains are structured? And this is asked by BM Schnell. The answer, BM Schnell, is yes. This is, in fact, if as we talk about on the pod all the time, the crunch for high bandwidth memory, HBM. HBM is just memory being stacked directly on top of compute. It's really expensive to make. We're still learning how to make it at scale. But high bandwidth memory, the way the high bandwidth is achieved is literally by stacking the memory layer by layer on top of the compute in the third dimension. So in short, transformers and AGI were the final forcing function for, and Ray has spoken about this a little bit years ago, but for forcing chip architecture, not just stacking multiple layers of compute on top of each other, because Moore's law as an areal, AREAL, areal density law is asymptoting, so we need to build into the third dimension. It's not just the end of Moore's law that's forcing 3D chip architectures. It's the need for insanely high bandwidths because the models are very large and the models can't all be loaded in because of the way transformer forward passes are organized, can't all be loaded into the transistors that are performing the arithmetic for those forward passes all at once. It's done progressively as a forward pass. As a result, we need insanely high bandwidths from the memory to the compute. And the only way to do that is by stacking the memory on top of the compute, which gives us the third dimension. So in short, yes.
And what finally breaks us out of 5 gigahertz for good?
Yeah, photonic computing, I think, has the potential to give us 1,000x clock speed up. So we're stuck right now at about 4 or 5 gigahertz clock speeds. If we move to photonic-based computing, we could keep, in principle, the rest of the architecture looking superficially like CMOS digital while still amping up the clock speed by 1,000x. So we'd get terahertz instead of gigahertz, well, without having to make major architectural changes. That's superficially, that's why I think photonics are so attractive as a next big thing after CMOS silicon.
If a mind can live inside a language model, could one also be hiding somewhere far stranger?
Nice.
If I could just pile onto this one, I'd give maybe a couple of additional addenda. One is the architecture of the AlphaFold series, like AlphaFold 3 and its successors, although it does include a transformer, it's relatively exotic when you compare it with the reasoning models that we're all accustomed to using day to day. For example, the attention mechanism. Normally, attention is quadratic in the sense that this is a little bit mathy, so forgive me. But attention is normally based on queries, keys, and values. That's sort of one of the key insights. Attention's all you need. That resulted in the transformer revolution. The AlphaFold series uses a higher order version of attention called triangle attention. So it's not just tokens attending to other tokens. It's tokens attending to tokens attending to tokens in a triangle. And the reason for this is deeply related to the way proteins fold, which is what AlphaFold was created to solve. It has to do with wanting to, in a neutral way, optimize the angles between triples of peptides or triples of oligos. So AlphaFold, if I were asked, like, what would consciousness, human recognizable consciousness, look like in if you're looking at triangle attention between residues in proteins, if there is some sort of consciousness that pops out of this higher order attention mechanism and all of the other machinery that went into AlphaFold, I think it would probably look pretty exotic and superficially unrecognizable relative to, say, like the J space that's pretty interpretable relative to what we think of as an attention bottleneck in humans. I'm not saying it's not there. I'm just saying if it is there, or in some derivative of some future frontier model that treats peptide sequences as a first-class modality, it's probably going to be an exotic form of consciousness.
Well, picking up on what Alex just said, too, let me throw one more.
That was the ASI Pill, episode 270. Recursive self-improvement is not coming, it is shipping. We would rather build Maitreya than fear it. Subscribe, stay ASI pilled, and we will see you at the frontier.